All right, let's check our mic out and see if we're on. Can y'all hear? Hey, Brad, I think it's on. Can you hear? Okay, folks, if you'll go ahead and come on in, we'll try to begin our class this morning. Hope everybody's doing well. I think everybody's making it. So I often use Joan as a sounding board for what we're doing, and I've, asked last week to confirm my suspicion that a lot of this is over our heads. She agreed. It's not intentional to be over our heads. It's over my head too, to be honest with you. But she says, I'm not going to quote that she says you need to dumb this down, but that's pretty well what she said. Because I'm afraid that if I say dumbing it down, you're going to imply that the dummy is out there, and often it's because the dummy is back here. But things that are new to us tend to be a little complicated, aren't they? They are for me. They make us somewhat uncomfortable. It's ironic that this morning as I was getting dressed, John Tesh is on the radio often. You probably listen to him from time to time. John has the ability to, there's an answer for everything. Have you ever noticed that? It's no matter what kind of scientific research comes out, that's an answer for just about everything. So he was talking about what he called, or what psychologists or whoever calls, social snacking. I thought that it was very interesting because he was talking about how people tend to watch the same TV shows or the same movies over and over again. Do you do that? I think most of us do to a certain extent, and why is that? There are certain things that we find very comforting and very easy to absorb when we watch them repeatedly. I like to watch the Hobbit series, and I've watched it several times so that I can know pretty well what's coming. My grandkids love Star Wars. They can quote almost every aspect of the different Star Wars and Mandalorian and all of that kind of stuff because, it's something they do. So we find comfort in things that we are familiar with, and I don't think the Bible is any different. We find comfort in familiar scriptures, those things that we go to all the time. So when we get outside that realm, it becomes somewhat more uncomfortable for us because learning something new is never easy for most of us. It's certainly not easy for me. So I say that I feel your pain. It would be, in all honesty, a lot more simple for me if I were to say, let's study and look at the book of James, okay? It would not require nearly as much, in-depth searching and overview and repetitive stuff as I'm trying to do. Not to say that I mind doing that. That's how I learn. But just to say that I understand what you may be going through, and if you have any questions, feel free to let's toss it back and forth, and we'll try to see if we can figure it out. I promised you last week that we were going to take a look at some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Remember, we're looking at the scrolls that were found at the time of Jesus, how that varied from our Codex Bible that we look at, that makes it so easy and so familiar to us just to flip chapters, but they weren't able to do that, and weren't able to do that for a good time after the time of Jesus, and the fact that it was organized, the Hebrew Bible, in a different way than what we have, but also that way gives more insight, perhaps, into the way that Jesus read the Scriptures, talked about the Scriptures, and when he talks about in the New Testament the Torah, the law, the prophets, and the writings, that there was a purpose that he had in doing that. So let's talk a bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of us have heard that term, okay? Most of us are somewhat familiar. We've seen, looks at them, and we've said, what's the use of that? As again, my dear wife said, they're written in Hebrew. I can't read them. Therefore, there's a limited amount of knowledge that can be gained from that, but I think it's interesting. A little history aspect of what was going on in the contemporary time of Jesus and prior to this. We talked last week a little bit about the exile, going into Babylonian captivity, at which the Temple of Solomon was completely destroyed, basically. An immense temple that was built by Solomon. It was gone. As the people began to filter back, and remember Nebuchadnezzar allowed them to come back to a certain extent, Nehemiah and Ezra tell us about that. They began to rebuild the temple. This went on from about 450, around 500 BC, and the temple remained in various forms and was built and completed and enhanced during that period of time until it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So you've got about 550, close to 600 years that the second temple was built, and we talked about the second temple writings that often occurred. A lot of literature was produced, even though it was written on scrolls. There was no other way to write it. A lot of thought went into the Bible, into what had been presented to the people and tried to meticulously maintain during this whole period of time. This was not easy to do. Remember, our technology is so convenient that probably what we write, perhaps what we are recording today, may be available hundreds of years into the future that we have no concept of, and obviously they had no way of doing that. So there was a lot of changes that had taken place. Judaism was a very diverse movement. The geographical location lent itself to this. You probably can figure out why. It's in, the side crescent of the Mediterranean Sea. A lot of trade would have been going on. The cultural capitals, I guess, would have been originally Greece, which had been transferred over to the Rome, and also Alexandria down in Egypt. So those were two big areas. Trading routes went through parts of Syria and Israel and over into further east of there, where they traded for goods and spices and all that kind of stuff. We're familiar with, Columbus looking for a shortcut, but this trade routes have been going on for centuries with trying to get the ability for trade for goods. So you had a lot of area. Israel was kind of right in the middle of this. I remember during biblical times, other than the immediate countries that we find, most of those were pretty isolated countries. You didn't hear a lot about other external countries, but as times changed, it became more prevalent. Obviously, those countries of Babylon and Persia and Greece and then eventually Rome all came into the picture, so that the people of Israel had been dispersed. They were no longer isolated right in that one little area. And because of the influence of all of these other cultures, the city of Jerusalem and the political aspect was different than what it used to be earlier during the time of Moses and the kings and such. So you have to remember that aspect. There had been continual, in the last couple of hundred years BC, a lot of struggle, and a lot of alliances were formed. A lot of political deals had been struck to try to maintain Israel's importance in the area. I don't want to say their dominance, because they were no longer dominant, but their importance, especially among those Jews who felt like they were God's chosen people, and they wanted to maintain that as much as they could. But you had a lot of struggles and a lot of battles to see who was going to win. Was it going to be Egypt? Was it going to be Rome? And eventually the Romans won out. Changes had also occurred within the area of the Jewish leadership and the temple worship. They had really gotten more and more in bed with the Romans as time went on, and at the time of Jesus this was a big conflict. But the conflict amongst the Jews and amongst the priests even occurred much before the time of Jesus. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls came into play. You've heard of Qumran, the city or establishment that was only about 20 miles from Jerusalem. So, the question comes into play is, why was there an establishment? Who was part of this, and why did it exist? Qumran was a community, a sizable community. They really don't know how many, but it was a sizable community that you can actually still see the ruins of today if you go over there. So there was a settlement there, basically. It's believed, composed of priests who were basically lost their their association with the other priest on it because of their dissatisfaction with the way that things were progressing and began to be run. There was a challenge as far as the liturgy was concerned. When I say liturgy, do you know what we're talking about? Just in case you don't, the order of worship. Those things that are spelled out to say, here's how our worship will be conducted. There was dissatisfaction amongst this relatively large group of priests concerning the calendar, the Jewish calendar. Again, the Roman calendar and stuff had began to come into play. There was dissatisfaction there. There was dissatisfaction even as far as how sacrifices were to be done. So apparently, and we're not really knowledgeable about all of this, but it's pretty well assumed that this was a big part of it. There was a struggle, and the priest who eventually wound up in Qumran lost. So they were basically kicked out somewhere around 150 to 100 BC, well before the time of Jesus that we're going on. So it's interesting when you look at these Dead Sea Scrolls, and a lot of this I did not realize. They wrote extensively. They were biblical nerds. who really, really wanted to hold on and to grasp the aspects of Judaism as it had existed in the past before the time of the influence of all of these other countries came in. So they had a settlement there, and part of their settlement was on one side of the mountain, and part of their settlement, especially where they did the work, was on the other side of the mountain in this series of caves. You've heard of the caves in Qumran. That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually found. It's interesting to me, they were only discovered in about 1948 or 49. I've heard different stories, whether it was shepherds, whether it was a shepherd boy who stumbled upon these caves. Apparently they were very well hidden. Remember the nature of the desert in the mountains. Not very much rain, but when it did rain, what happened? You had a deluge, and it did a lot of erosion. So apparently over a period of time, these caves became somewhat exposed, and this fellow or fellows stumbled upon them, and they began to uncover these jars which contain the scrolls. Now that's what those priests did apparently for a long time. We read about scribes in the Bible, and that's the scribes, or some of them priests, would actually copy scroll to scroll to scroll in their effort to try to maintain these documents. But in addition to this, they wrote a lot of what we would call commentaries. I didn't know that. Discourse, when we talk about the writings of the Second Temple writings, that's what we're talking about oftentimes, is things that were written, again, on scrolls, talking about and interpreting and giving knowledge to these different scrolls that we find concerning the Bible. The excavation of these caves, and there were many caves, not just one, but there were, I don't know, they have them numbered, and you can actually go and look and see what was found where if you choose to do so. But almost all the books of the Bible, of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, were fragments of that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The most complete one that we have, you probably know, is from the book of Isaiah. All 66 chapters in Isaiah were found in, not necessarily complete because there are fragments of them, but they're found in some aspects of those. So there were multiples in multiple caves, fragments of Isaiah, not just one. So their whole purpose was to copy, and I don't know whether they just was trying to maintain it, to make sure, or trying to maintain to see if they were distributed, or exactly what the case was. But I found it interesting that there were multiple copies of some of these books going all the way back. But there literally were thousands of these different fragments relating to writings that were taking place contemporary right before Jesus and also during this time. What happened to them? It's thought pretty strongly then in AD 70, when the Romans were coming to completely destroy Jerusalem, that they were aware of these settlements, and all they did was had to march 20 miles down the road to the Dead Sea, and top of the Dead Sea, and they also tried to destroy, or did, the settlement anyway. The caves were hidden. The scribes or the priest, had the foresight, or had the foresight to hide these scrolls in these jars before they came, and they remained hidden for all this period of time. It's kind of an amazing, I think, an amazing story of how God has, looked after things. Obviously, the book of Isaiah and the translation is pretty well identical to what we find in the Bible. the aspect. There are writings that talk about commentaries on the consistency of God. We think we're so smart, but our thought process is probably not nearly as complete as a lot of those folks were on that, about how God relates to people on there. If you had to answer the question about the consistency of God, how would you sum it up? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Perfection, okay. We can go with, pardon? He has always been there and always will be there. Okay, all right. The permanence of God. What else?
Does not contradict himself.
Okay, the lack of contradiction. How about a big one to me is the consistency of God. That's been a theme that I'm able to hone into for many, many years. When we say the consistency of God, how does consistency relate to the New Testament? How does it relate to us today? Number one, what would that be? Two things. Number one, consistency of God.
I think that there's a plan, that there was always a plan.
All right. And what's part of that plan that we have going back to Genesis? You've heard of covenant relationships, promises, contracts. What's the contract that we find in Genesis? He made it with Abraham. What did he say? That he would be blessed, right? That his descendants would outnumber the sands of the sea, that promises were made. Can we figure out promises in relating to the New Testament? Do we have promises that are meaningful to us today? Sure. It's that through, as we talked about, found in Luke, that when Jesus was talking about himself, he was talking about a priest, a high priest, an anointed one, that he says, me, was forecast to come, to suffer, to die, to go through death and be raised up, so that what? We would have the promise of rescue. Remember, we talked about rescue, salvation. How? Through our trust in him. That was Jesus' words. That relates to this promise. And it goes through Jesus, and at the end of that, he talks about that this promise will extend not only to the Jews, but to who else? All nations, Gentiles included, not a respecter of person. So that promise has been consistent through the Old Testament, okay? The nature of God, the relationship that we have. Also, secondly, what else do we find as far as the nature of God? This is I don't know which one is more sobering, whether the hope that we have of eternal salvation, that's pretty important. But there's also another message that consistently runs through with the nature of God. He keeps his promise, and one of those promises is if we have not been rescued, what's going to happen? The outcome is not going to be good. Okay? Now, isn't it interesting? It is to me that this aspect that we find in these Dead Sea Scrolls relate very much to Christianity, even though they took place 150 years before Jesus ever came and was born. So an interesting concept. We're going to view these in just a second. But there's also aspects of this which I found very interesting, was the order of worship amongst this group of priests that took place. If you read that, and I haven't read it, I've read, dissertations about it, that it was almost like a monastic society where functions of the priest in this Qumran community were very much spelled out on how they were to do daily activities, how they were to worship, how they were to conduct their lives along with each other. Interestingly, there's a big cemetery there. It has I don't think it's been exhumed. I think it's still there. But over 1,000 markers. I don't know how they really know without peeping inside some of them, but by far the majority of these folks were men. Men, priest, a monastery. What does that sound like? Sounds like the Catholic orders, doesn't it? And again, it's interesting because I had never thought about that. I thought about where, the Catholic Church get this aspect of maintaining monks and different societies, primarily of unmarried men. But again, that's interesting. I do not know what the status of those priests were. I do not know their idea of marriage and this kind of stuff. But again, it's kind of interesting. There was their leader was a man that we don't know his name, I don't think, but he was the teacher of enlightenment. Interesting. Their concept apparently was that they were on the path of how to live so that they would receive eternal life. Valerie? Stephanie, sorry.
I watch a lot of History Channel and all that stuff, and their day-to-day lives were very ordered, just like monks today. And they said that there was no facilities inside the Qumran itself, like a bathroom. So they had to go outside into the hills when they needed to go to the bathroom. But every time they did that, before they could come back in, there was a mikvah there, and they had to go through the cleansing ceremony again.
Yeah.
Every time they had to go to the bathroom.
And a lot of this, interestingly, is not supposition. It's what's written in these scrolls that can be read and translated from Hebrew. So we have a pretty good idea of what they were. Tim, did you have a question? Oh, okay, over that way. Okay. So there we are. There's some other things that I found to be interesting too in some of these scrolls. There was one made of copper. Most of them, of course, as we've discussed, were made of leather, probably sheep leather, some papyrus or paper, but most of them were some form of leather. But there was one that was made of copper. Have you ever heard of that one at all? In that copper one, it talks about a hidden treasure that was hidden. Hidden treasure would be hidden, wouldn't it? And it has a large amount of money involved with it. Thousands, I can't remember how much it was, it says. And that's actually was found in these Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, you can imagine what has transpired over the years and books being written about the hunt for this treasure, and many people have undertaken that. Unfortunately, it was kind of like when I was a kid and producing treasure maps. We've probably, if you're a boy, you've probably always had a treasure map of some sort. But my idea of a map was no different than theirs was, because it started out with something like underneath the porch steps, or where the old tree was. So obviously, in 2,000 years, references had changed. And that treasure has never been found, even though many people, I think, have tried to find it. It's forbidden now, I think, to even search for that treasure, but it probably was looted during the time of Romans or somewhere around that idea. There was a movie several years ago. I never saw that movie, but what was it that was kind of a conspiracy theory about a treasure being hidden? Y'all remember that or not?
Was it National Treasure, or are you talking about that one?
No, I don't think so. Maybe it was.
They're still looking there. I mean, I did, maybe against the law, but they're still archaeologists.
They still sneak out, and they still haven't found it. So.
There was one thing they said that the Ark of the Covenant and Golden Candlestick was hidden in Mount Nebo. Think about that, that's an exacting place. Everybody knows where Mount Nebo is, they think. But Mount Nebo is kind of like Mount Sinai. There's people that says this mountain is Sinai, and then there's people that go say, no, this mountain is Sinai.
But it is, that's an aspect of it that I don't think we'll ever find out for sure, because I don't believe in this scroll the specific references are given at all whatsoever. So, when you watch documentaries and stuff, we have to keep that aspect in mind that, a lot of this is, they want to make it interesting, so they pull a lot of facts into it that may or may not be somewhat accurate on there. Any other questions? Let's take a look now, if we can, and let's see if we can pull up this. Just show a few aspects of this Dead Sea Scroll. One of the things right there is, as you scroll through this, and this is actually a digitalized copy of the Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah in this case. It's maintained by the historical aspect of the country of Israel. It's maintained, obviously, in a heavily secured museum locker. You can go to this, and this link is actually at the Israeli Museum. You can view these scrolls and other scrolls too. This one has been translated. If you, not from this point, you have to just play with this and find out how it works. But there's a couple of aspects that I really want to point out. On the right-hand side, scroll to, see where the page ends and a page begins. That is, an aspect of it that it was sewn together with threads of some kind. You can obviously see, if we go back, and we won't do that, but if you go back to the beginning of the scroll, remember this thing was rolled out. It's read right to left, so the beginning of the scroll is actually on the far right if you rolled it out. And go back, if you click on number 1 down at the bar, then that'll take us all the way back to the beginning. There you go. That's the beginning. See how worn it is? If you go to the end of it, then now 54, I found out, does not correspond to chapters. It's a relative indicator of where you are in the scroll itself. All 66 chapters are found in this. But as you look at this aspect of it, it is still worn, perhaps not as much as the beginning of it is. But again, this just is, tells us of how the people actually looked at it. They rolled it out. The length of this, I didn't have a clue how big it was, but it's about 3 feet. So the entire book of Isaiah was written on a scroll approximately 3 feet in length. It's interesting. Let's go back. Go around to chapter 35 if we can, and that's around 28 on that bottom bar. Scroll that way just a little bit. You can exit out of that where it says chapter 35 and grab it and scroll that to the right just a little bit. I think you'll have to exit out and now grab it with your mouse and pull it the other way. Keep going. There you go. All right. On the left-hand side, on the upper, about the last part of the third, enlarge that if we can. All right, scroll the other way. Keep going. All right, stop. Look in the center of the screen. What do you notice? If anything, at the very top.
Seems like smaller writing.
Okay? And if you really look at this, it's different writing, indicating that there was more than one person involved in the copying of this scroll. Apparently, there was a scribe A and a scribe B. That smaller writing is actually, it won't tell you there, but that's actually a different verse. Apparently, scribe A got distracted when he went back over and started recopying things. He missed a verse. So this is where scribe B, who was obviously had better eyesight and probably had not stayed up as late the night before, so he started copying. He ran out of room, and what happened? You see it on the other page coming down? He did just like we often do. He started writing in the margins of the scroll. So, there's definitely a human characteristic in the maintenance of these scrolls, which, that's a concept that, a lot of times I think, to me anyway, is very foreign to what I picture the scroll. Tim?
It's hard to believe that all 66 books fit on the scroll that's 3 feet long.
It is.
That would have to be some very tiny.
Small
print to
writing.
start with.
Yeah. That plus remember when last week we were talking about the Hebrew language and the fact that there's not nearly as many words in Hebrew as there are in English. So when you click on a verse on this and the translation comes up, what may be a fairly short sentence is actually expanded in English language because the translation just requires that to be done. But it's interesting. You can go through, there are places here which we will not have time to do, or I don't think, yeah, this is 22. I don't think, but there are places actually where you can see where words have been dotted above. And it's pretty well been verified that these are areas where in one text, they probably had more than one scroll. One scroll contained a word, the second scroll did not. And they put the word in but dotted it to indicate that there was a difference between one scroll and another scroll. There's places in there where it's very obvious in torn sections that they've taken and repaired the scroll itself. So a lot of effort went into to do this. But I thought that you would find it interesting to actually, I had never looked at one of these, but the fact that we can go and view documents such as this that have been maintained literally for thousands of years. And Isaiah, in this case, is the oldest known document that we have of the Bible. But, yeah.
I just have a question, it may sound dumb. You said this is leather?
Or probably sheep.
Sheep, okay. Because of the light color, so they just didn't tan it to where it sort of kept that light color.
I don't really,
Written on?
I don't really know, but just like when you find leather that have been tanned, rabbit leather looks significantly different than cattle leather would, so I think it just depends on the species of it, and probably how much tanning has been done, the chemicals that were used on there. Indians, it's my understanding, used actually parts of brains, of animal brains, to actually tan the leather on it. I don't know what they used on it. Any other questions? Do what? I don't know, but they found the majority of them in fragments. Again, fragments might mean a piece this big, but because of the translation and interpretation, they can link those to all of them. Majority, I know for a fact, all of the books of the Torah, the Pentateuch, all of those 5 have been found. The majority of the prophets and the writings of others too. So the majority of them were found, but literally, from what I understand in my readings, there have been literally thousands of different writings that were associated with those. I don't know if it's still true or not, but as of several years ago, there were scrolls that had been discovered in some of these caves that still had not been unrolled. Obviously, the government of Israel is well aware of the historical aspect and the desire to preserve these, so they are very meticulous as far as, just unrolling them. One thing that I thought was very unique, the first 5 that were found in one of these caves, including the Isaiah scroll, in 1948 or 49 or 50, whenever it was, and not a lot of people knew about this. There was an ad that took place in the New York Times by a fella from Bethlehem who, I've read different things. One said he had a gas station. One said he had a little shop area, but he actually put a want ad for one of those scrolls in the New York Times back in those days. Can you imagine what the value of what he was selling there from a historical aspect of it? It just kind of blows your mind about what has transpired all these times. Lori? And some of these, you probably just didn't catch it, some of these scrolls were made of papyrus, or parchment, or basically paper, early modern paper. Paper obviously would not have lasted as long, even in desert conditions, even in rolled up jars, as leather would. But these were actually used, so we got to remember that they were producing these hopefully for people to be used. They were used in the time of Jesus, so probably what was written 150 years BC was not the same scroll that would have been used in the temple during Jesus' time. It would have been a new one. They would have been handled to such an extent that they probably would have deteriorated greatly. Any other questions? I don't know about the aspect of the bell, but I would encourage you sometime when you have a little bit of time. It's very simple. Do a search for digital Dead Sea Scrolls if you're interested in looking at these. There are others. The others that I saw have not been translated. They probably eventually will be, but some of these are not the biblical scrolls. They are related to, like we were talking about, this aspect of this orderly way of living that they did. There's another one that talks about the war, not necessarily an apocalyptic war that would be from God, but a literal physical war that these priests thought that was going to occur. They actually had thought that they would team up with an ally They don't know if it was Rome or not, to fight what they called the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. Does that sound somewhat vaguely familiar from a biblical standpoint? It really does. And when you think about John's aspect of writing, he talks so much about light and darkness. You know, it just it's interesting, the concepts that I think that we have. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your attention.